Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
Throughout this whole book, I think we're really going to see that Daniel is a really good example that the heat doesn't make the man, but the heat reveals the man. The trial, it doesn't make you who you are, but it reveals what God's already been working in your heart. And every time the heat gets turned on, Daniel's ready for it. He's already been prepared. He's already a man of character. And every time the fire shows up, so to say, he's ready. He's ready for it. And he presents himself with integrity and discernment and peace.
As kingdoms rise and fall, one truth remains unshaken. God is always in control. The world may trust in itself, but we as believers trust in the Lord. As believers come together, they can also become an immovable force for God. In Daniel chapter 2, a dream becomes the stage for God's unmatched wisdom and sovereign power. Join us as we discover how the God who reveals mysteries also directs the course of history, and why that gives his people confidence for every generation. Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Daniel as he continues his message, How Much Greater a Kingdom.
This is Daniel chapter 2. We just began the book of Daniel the last time we were together. You might remember the theme of this 12-chapter book is God's power to bring Israel through the kingdoms of this world to exaltation. It's very much focused on the nation of Israel, but bringing about the kingdom of God with Israel in the end. And so all through this book, and you might remember this outline that we put up on the screen the last time, this book is broken down into two halves. There is a historical chronology first for the first 6 chapters of the book, and then there's a more detailed prophetic visions that come about in chapters 7 through 12. And so just looking through the first 6 chapters of this book, it very much mirrors and prototypes and foreshadows exactly the end time scenario. Chapter 1, we saw Daniel and his friends pictured as a believer in an unbelieving world, learning how to go through an unbelieving world without defiling themselves. Here we are in chapter 2. Tonight, we're going to see all the world kingdoms and empires, but they're all ended by the kingdom. Capital T, the kingdom to come. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. Chapter 3, then, we see it's a prototype of the believer being raptured. Daniel's not there while the 3 boys go through the fire, a picture of going through the tribulation. And then chapter 4, we're going to see the king of Babylon as a picture of Satan being bound in chapter 4, just as Satan will be bound during the 1,000-year millennial kingdom. Chapter 5, then, we have Earth's rulers. They gather themselves together for one last battle, but they're overthrown by, in this case, by prototype, the Medo-Persians overthrow them. And then finally, in chapter 6, we see that new world-ruling empire who's known for their laws that change not. And they are established in chapter 6, and that is a picture of the eternal state in which the laws will change not for good. Here we are in Daniel chapter 2, and this chapter shows us such a difference in how Daniel lives as a true believer versus how the world's kingdoms endure. This chapter 2 of Daniel will bring out these 4 world-ruling empires, and we're going to see, I'm going to really try to highlight 3 contrasts between the world's kingdoms and the kingdom of God to come in the end. So throughout this chapter, this is the chapter of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has with the statue, and Daniel's going to interpret this dream with the statue, and all these world-ruling empires are pictured in this statue. But in looking at these world-ruling empires, I think we'll draw some very big differences between what man can do versus what God's kingdom will be like in the end. And so to begin off chapter 2, we'll start here with our first point, talking about this much greater kingdom to come. And so, to begin the first 16 verses of chapter 2, I think this is the part where Daniel will hear about the dream. Nebuchadnezzar has the dream, and they're trying to find someone to interpret this dream, and what do we do about this? And I think we're going to see how the world has their worldly wisdom, but believers have godly wisdom, and they are 2 different things. And let's take a look at that as this begins in chapter 2, verse 1. Now, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep fled from him. So far, he sounds like every one of us. But in verse 2, it says, Then the king said to call to his magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and they stood before the king. So he gathers up what should be all of the smart men of the day. And already we see 4 examples here of worldly wisdom. All 4 of these really represent different categories of worldly wisdom that people still try to go to today. I don't think we should look at these lists and say, oh, well, that was something just very specific that Babylon had. No, this is worldly wisdom. This is what it looks like to lean on your own understanding. Let's start with the first one here. It mentions the magicians. The magicians, that's kind of the idea. The literal interpretation of that is one that draws magical lines, is what the word means. It's what are we talking about? We're talking about those that followed the horoscopes, the ones that look to the stars. Oh, we don't have anybody that does that today. Yes, we do. We still do. We still have people that will look to the zodiac and try to interpret from that what their individual meaning of life is. Isn't that so sad, though? You look to the stars for your answers instead of looking to the very one who made those stars for your answers. How much missing the point can you have? You know, and then we get the second one here. It says, in some translations, it says conjurers. The idea here is to practice enchantments, and literally it's to conjure up the dead. And so now we've got folks that are not afraid to get into demonic power, satanic powers. And there's still people today that will do these types of things to conjure up demons, conjure up devils, whether they know that or not, to present themselves as smart and wise. I was just listening. Have you ever heard of this one that's been going around lately? This lady, what's her name? Hicks. I think it's Sarah Hicks maybe, but it's last name Hicks. And she goes around, does these seminars. Of course, she makes a lot of money at these seminars. And she talks about conjuring up her good friend Abraham. And Abraham actually is a whole legion of people. Interesting term that she puts there, legion, to these people that she conjures up, and they go by the name Abraham. And so they actually call her Abraham Hicks while she's possessed and she's going through this ritual. I want to say go look it up, but don't bother. It's just another example of people conjuring up not just worldly wisdom, but worldly wisdom that would even go to the devil to seek help and guidance. And it was in Babylon, it's here today, and it's no different. It's the same sources that people turn to. Well, then we have the third one here that he calls the sorcerers. The sorcerers, that literally means to whisper a spell. It is a sorcerer. That's the idea. Fourth one, Chaldeans. Now, you might look at that and you might say, well, we don't rely on Chaldeans today. But what was the idea of saying that he called on the Chaldeans? The idea is that the Chaldeans were some of the ancient inhabitants of parts of Babylon. Okay, so what I'm drawing at here, they were the descendants of Hasid, or ancient ones. And my point I'm trying to make is people still do that today. They'll rely on just the person that's been around the longest. Or how about this? The ancient cult groups with a Masonic temple. Well, they've been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They must be trustworthy. No, just because you've been around a long time doesn't automatically make you one that has godly wisdom to offer you, okay? Now, I do believe I skipped just a little something here. I wanted to mention about sorcerers, the third one listed there. When it talks about sorcerers actually comes from the words for hallucinations. So what do you think the modern application of that is? Well, certainly we're talking about those that would want to go to altered states of consciousness for wisdom of any variety, whether it's drug use or anything else. So between all of these, I think you see a pretty full picture of what it means to rely on your own wisdom or wisdom of the world or the resources that are material and earthly or flat out demonic, but not of God. And this is who they call. Before we look at this and we make fun of Nebuchadnezzar for calling all these people to his side, challenge yourself first and say, is this what I do in a crisis? Would I call all of the forms of worldly wisdom to bear myself before asking God for his counsel? Would I just call up the smart person around and ask them first? Would I look to the stars? Would I look to this resource or that resource? Or would I look to God? Would I look to his word to get the answers? So be careful that we don't just jump on him without first analyzing ourselves as well, right? So this is the same thing that we are faced with today. Men look to the powers of creation, whether it's the stars or demons or drugs or men, and we look for all of these things instead of looking to the Creator. And so here's where it begins. He calls all of his worldly wisdom together. Now, verse 3, then the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans, they're the first ones to speak, the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, and they said, O king, live forever. Say the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. One little technical note before we go much further. I'm going to set you up, so don't answer this question. The Old Testament was written in what language? Don't answer me. Mostly Hebrew is the answer. Beginning right here, actually, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, until we get to, actually, verse 4b, when this quote begins, the whole way until chapter 7, verse 28, is actually written in Aramaic. Almost all of your Old Testament is written in Hebrew. This is written in Aramaic for the next 5 chapters. There's parts of Ezra chapter 4 through 7 that are also written in Aramaic for multiple reasons. Those were official letters that were being given in those days when Aramaic was the language for official correspondence. And of course, right here we have the Babylonians speaking, and so that's a good indication of why we have this written in Aramaic. So just a little technical note right there. So if you start getting into the language and you start looking up these words and you're like, I don't understand these, why are they different? That's why, because they're not even Hebrew at all. But look, classic politicians here in verse 3 and verse 4, right? The Chaldeans come and they play the prototypical politician view of things here, always trying to butter people up to maintain their position. Oh, king, live forever. You're the best. We can help you. And they're just trying to get information from him. Really, they're thinking, we don't have a clue. But if we can get him to give us some more information, maybe we can make something up that sounds good. Once we get through this chapter, you understand that's exactly what they were trying to do right here. They're just trying to butter him up, make him feel good so that he'll spill some more information, and then they can make up something that sounds good, but it's not going to work. And so they're trying to get information from him. And now in verse 5, goes on and says, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. Like, I'm not going to tell you anything else, is the idea. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap, or I like the Old English, a dunghill. Verse 6, but if you declare the dream and its interpretation, then you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great glory. Therefore, declare to me the dream and the interpretation, both. In verse 7, they answered a second time, and they said, let the king say the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation. But the king, in verse 8, he answered, and he said, I know for certain that you are just buying time, insomuch as you have seen that the word from me is firm. In verse 9, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there's only one law for you. Indeed, you have agreed together to speak lies and corrupt words before me until the time is changed, just to buy time, right? Therefore, say the dream to me that I may know, there's your key word, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. You ever have those times when you're with a friend and you're getting counsel from a friend, or you're just talking to a friend and they're giving you counsel and you're like, okay, but then maybe another time you got a really serious matter and you go to your friend and you're like, listen, now tell me the truth. I really need to know. Right? You ever have those times? That's what he's doing. He's saying basically to them, listen, I'm intentionally not telling you the dream because I want to know for sure that you actually know what you're talking about. I want to know for sure that if I just told you the dream, you just make up some interpretation that sounded good, and then I'd never know if you actually knew what you were talking about. The king is saying, listen, this is so important to me. Something radical happened in my dream. I have to know if what you're saying is accurate or not. You know why he's saying that? He's saying, I'm about to make life decisions based on what this dream was. So I have to know what you're telling me is true. It's a pretty powerful way the king's coming to them. So in two ways, the king is declaring the importance of receiving a very true interpretation here. First of all, he's saying that there's going to be great reward and great consequence. So he's upping the stakes, like, I really need to get this right. But then the king also is not willing to tell his dream to make sure he gets a real supernatural response. He doesn't just want politics. He wants a genuine supernatural response. So he's clearly making this a very important subject that he wants a very legitimate answer to. Verse 10. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth." That is correct. There is not a man on earth that can do this. There is not a man on earth who is able to declare the matter for the king, insomuch as no great king or powerful ruler has ever asked about a matter like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, in verse 11, the matter which the king asks is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except gods. I will narrow that down to God, whose dwelling place is not with flesh. They realize they're in a heap of trouble now. Doesn't this beg the question, like, what have they been doing at their job, being his counselors for all of these years? You know, have you seen that movie? Like, what exactly do you do here? You know, it's exactly what he's saying to them. Like, what exactly have you been doing for me all these years? You've just been lying to me to get along? And now he's calling them out, and they have to admit it. Listen, what you're asking for, it's not possible. You're asking for something supernatural. Praise God, as Christians, we can ask for things that are supernatural. And so we have that type of relationship with God. These are chances right here when it's not possible for mankind that the servants of God can pray to a supernatural God and ask God to intervene. These are the chances for the servants of the true God to really step up and really shine when the situations are humanly impossible. I used to have that sign above my desk like 20 years ago that said, when the situation is impossible for man, it's still possible for God. And this is one of those right here. In fact, wasn't Joseph of the Old Testament caught in a similar situation just like this? Do you remember when he interpreted the butler and the baker's dreams, and then he's called before Pharaoh to do the same thing, to interpret Pharaoh's dream? And here in Genesis chapter 41, listen to how Joseph talks to the Pharaoh about how, quote unquote, he can interpret dreams. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have heard a dream, but no one can interpret it. Yet I have heard it said about you that you can hear a dream and that you can interpret it." Do you see the opportunity for Joseph to wrongly steal glory right here? But Joseph answered Pharaoh, and he said, "It is not in me. God will answer concerning the welfare of Pharaoh." You see all these little subtle opportunities to make sure we don't accidentally steal God's glory, and that we put it back on the Lord. Say, He's going to do this for you. And so Joseph says, "It's not in me, but God." So it's very interesting here back in Daniel that their gods don't dwell among flesh. No one can do this but God, whose dwelling place is not with flesh. That's just one more thing that sets our God different than every other false god out there. Our God came and dwelt among us, dwelt among flesh, and showed us exactly what to do and how to do it and who he was. Praise God. Well, let's continue here in verse 12 and get to the end of their ineptitude. Starting in verse 12. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious, and he said for them to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Who was it that's talking to him? The Chaldeans. But now he says, look, kill them all. If you're telling me this is impossible for man, then kill them all. It's sort of like a Solomon wanting to split the baby situation. Did Solomon really want to split the baby? No. He wanted to find out who the mother was. And so I believe this is a little bit like that. This is him saying, oh, you can't do it? Then kill them all. Kill them all. Now, we know a little bit about who Nebuchadnezzar was, and he may have actually gone through with that, knowing who he was. But I believe this is just another tactic of his to try to draw out a legitimate answer. And so, kill them all, he says. So the law went forth that the wise men were to be killed, and they sought out Daniel and his friends to kill them. Because you remember, at the end of chapter 1, they were appointed as wise men as well. So in verse 14, then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to kill the wise men of Babylon. In verse 15, he answered and he said to Arioch, who was a powerful official for the king, "For what reason is this law from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and he sought from the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. There's something here that is interesting that's not often talked about. You remember the situation with Esther? Not many years after what we're reading right now, maybe 100 years after what we're reading now, Esther goes before King Ahasuerus. And it was a big deal. Like, you don't just show up before the king uninvited. Now, Daniel here, it just says in this pinch, he just goes to the king. Now, Babylon's rules were a little bit different than in the Medo-Persian Empire later on for Esther. But still, this is a big deal. Just for him in verse 16 to walk in before the king. I don't believe this is just some new king that wants to, purge his political establishment, because he himself was responsible for putting some of these young men into their positions. I don't think he was really out just to kill them all. Oh, he put out the law, but the biggest thing he wants is an answer. What was this dream? And he's willing to do whatever it takes to get it. He put Daniel and these other men. He put lots of other ones in these prime positions. He wasn't looking to kill them. He wanted an answer. And so he wants an answer. For his part, Daniel already has his life on the line. So, to go before the king, it wasn't as cut and dry like it was for Esther. Esther had not much reason to fear in her situation if she didn't go before the king as far as her own life. But Daniel, his life's already on the line here. But it is interesting, though, to notice Daniel's calm demeanor, his wisdom by which he comes and he speaks to Arioch here, the leader. It says in verse 14, he replied with discretion and discernment to know what's going on. What can I do to help in this situation? Throughout this whole book, I think we're really going to see that Daniel is a really good example that the heat doesn't make the man, but the heat reveals the man. The trial, it doesn't make you who you are, but it reveals well, God's already been working in your heart. And every time the heat gets turned on, Daniel's ready for it. He's already been prepared. He's already a man of character. And every time the fire shows up, so to say, he's ready. He's ready for it. And he presents himself with integrity and discernment and peace. And he just jumps in, says, all right, what do we have to do next? This is hard. This is weird. What's next? Let's do it. Let's tackle it. And so we begin with these earthly wise men with no help whatsoever. But now we see God's man, Daniel, is going to step in. And starting in verse 17, we're going to see another difference now, I believe, between what the world has to offer in their kingdoms versus what God's kingdom has to offer. And here's number 2, beginning in verse 17. And that is that they trust in themselves, but we trust in God. We've already kind of alluded to it with Joseph interpreting the dreams. Daniel is going to come out right here with the same impression. That it's not about, well, what can I do to come up? Daniel's not going to go back and be like, okay, I've watched some time with the king. Now, what can I do to come up with an answer? Like, I didn't get an answer. Let me try harder. It doesn't work that way. It's not about just going back and drawing up some blueprint of how he can fool the king. The godly man, the godly woman, the wise person goes to the Lord, communes with the Lord and says, Lord, what do you want in this situation? And we're going to begin to see that. They trust in God. And so that's a very active thing. Somebody ever told you, well, just trust in God. And you're like, I don't know what that means. Has that ever happened to you? Well, just trust the Lord. And you're like, okay. And you really are thinking like, I don't know how to do that. Well, this is a pretty good example right here in these next few verses. Daniel's in a situation, doesn't know what to do. I'm sure some friend walked up to him and just said, well, just trust God. And Daniel puts that into action. And so let's just begin that in verse 17. It says, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to his friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. so that they might seek compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And there it is. They bring the crisis to the Lord, and the godly will always do that.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Daniel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check out our website at cchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Daniel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.